Hey, this is Hendrik Booz from George Marshall High School, giving you a little debrief on your first paper one for IB English Literature HL2. Okay, sorry. So there are three major focuses for our paper one. You're supposed to open with a clear understanding of the setting, the plot, the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, maybe even the how. A lot of you guys dealt with one or two of those, but not all of those. Let's just go with a bare minimum of a half a page for an introduction. A lot of you guys aren't even hitting two or three sentences in a paragraph. So if you feel like maybe we said something different, we didn't. That's what we want. Most of you guys dealt with some sort of style, but you didn't necessarily deal with the effects of that style, and not all of you dealt with the meaning, basic tenet of what's going on. So is that art and experience and memory in, say, Fishing on the Susquehanna by Billy Collins, or in his other poem, Winter Syntax, does that have something to do with the metaphor of writing to a journey? In Impossible Object by Mosley, does it deal with the tension between time and place, Rome and Los Angeles, the past and the present for Hippolyta, the main character, the tension between her husband and herself, her child and herself, her husband, her child, and herself. And then in the other piece, The Seas, that the tension between what we wanted the past to be and where we are now, the difference in memory there. Mr. Mohan has some specific ones for regeneration and astronauts, I believe. And then many of you guys got the golden lines, golden nuggets or key lines. The idea is that you're picking out lines from the passage that either don't make sense to you or that you can grapple with. IB wants you to be a little bit of a risk taker. You don't have to have all the answers, but by grappling with the really difficult lines from the piece, you're probably dealing with something that IB wants. So your areas of strength overall, most of you understand what the actual passages were about. I think only one or two students in my classes didn't really even get the passages or the poems. Your use of literary terms, the style, great. Your integration of text, for the most part, was good. We're going to talk a little bit about how not to use says as an introductory verb in your classes. The areas for growth that you guys need to deal with, the meaning and the central thread of your interpretation. What is the piece about? Don't try to talk in these broad terms about how men and women will never understand one another. That's just a generalization, and it's really a logical fallacy. Many of you are not thinking about simple 6th, 8th, 11th grade concepts of claims to open your paragraphs and transition sentences. If you have no claim, you have no argument. If you have no argument, you have no development. If you have no development, you're probably going to earn an overall 4, maybe even a 3. And then a lot of you guys are still kind of right-clicking, even though you're not using a computer, for looking for highfalutin verbiage. Eschew obfuscation is a joke. Really try to write simply. Clarity over complexity. Your writing should not be confusing, and stop using the passive voice. So, overall, here we go. The number one thing that we saw is that many of you are imposing an interpretation instead of building an argument through subsequent paragraphs. I wrote stick to the passage. Mr. Mohan talked about a precise and detailed close reading. You really don't want to use generalized big picture concepts. Deal with what is written on the page. Secondly, and this is going to deal now not only with your organization and development or criterion C and knowledge and interpretation, but B, authorial choices or literary elements. You really must deal with the meaning through style and effect. HL and SL Lit demands that you deal with how an author's choices affect the meaning of the piece. This little acronym here should say MSE, meaning through style and effect. And then the third point is that a lot of you guys don't really have a central thread that ends your paragraphs. You're not concluding. You just end abruptly without a transition. You move on to the next thing. Your paragraphs are islands in a lake. I need you to build a bridge between those islands. And then the last one, if you guys don't stop using the passive voice, you're never going to earn more than a 3 for language. You have to stop using the verb to be. So here are the observations that we're thinking about and talking about. We really want you to understand that you need to deal with the context of the passage. What's the message of the writer? Understand the difference between imposing an interpretation and then building an argument based on what you see on the page, and then tie references to that excerpt to that chosen idea. Some of you guys are using lines from the text, but you don't immediately then interpret it or offer commentary. Remember AEC? In 9th and 10th grade, you assert an argument, you show evidence, and then you offer commentary on the specific use of that text. In Criterion A, it even says, sustained interpretation supported by well-chosen references. For a 4. For a 3, it says appropriate references. For a 2, it says some appropriate references. Show us that you're making purposeful choices in citing text. So let's show you an example. This is the last sentence from one of your peers. Quote, the length of those two stanzas, 2 and 3, and the reason why I say sick is because I let this error stand. This should actually say the length of the second and third stanzas provide an insight into the incredibly taxing world of a writer. As the readers are placed into the action and are provided with a myriad of imagery of this fantastical story that is being told, the writer is moving across the treacherous blizzard alone. And actually, let's just quickly add this. This is clearly another reference to style. So here, where does the writer, the student, explain how length has an effect that is tied to this incredibly taxing world of a writer? I don't know what the insight is, so there's no meaning. There's some sort of reference to this idea of the taxing world, but I don't know what that is, and it wasn't really fully developed previously in the paragraph. Secondly, I don't understand what the imagery has to do with. This was a little bit better developed earlier on in the paragraph, but not necessarily here at the end. I don't know why the student chooses to use parentheses. I was taught that you skip over parentheses because the author didn't have enough time or foresight as to how to include or integrate that into his or her thoughts. So try to do so. Try to refrain from using parentheses. So overall here, you can see that the author doesn't explain himself or herself. Obviously, the passive voice is painful to look at. That's why it's in red, like blood. So the other element here is that we went through all of the mark schemes. A lot of you guys referenced imagery, but you didn't really deal with the narrative perspective. Some of you dealt with the tone of the author, but didn't really explain how the tone dealt with something, some sort of meaning. Structure was readily problematic in all of the prose pieces, but think about some of these other ones. Think about the sentence structure, right? Syntax, endings of the piece. Some of you only dealt with, you cherry-picked, only dealt with certain parts of the passages. And then irony is the big one. You can see that the length of a sentence, repetition, parallelism, those are all elements of style. For poetry, for my students, I saw a ton of references to structure, but not as much of a development as to how that structure affected the meaning. Imagery you guys use all the time, but I think you kind of heard that and used it, but you didn't necessarily use it as well as you could have. Again, think about elements like contrast, juxtaposition, look for patterns, repetition, parallelism again, narrative perspective, and then all of the other ones over here, the tension, the character, the dialogue, etc., etc., etc. So the overall papers and grades. A 4 pretty much understands what's going on, basic plot, but doesn't develop an interpretation. The students who earn 4s also list elements of style, but they don't analyze it. And so that's going to mire people in a 2 or a 3 for criterion B. Paragraphs are not cohesively connected, sorry. They're basically, like I said, they're islands in the storm. And so we want to make sure that you guys are all making connections at the ends of paragraphs and connecting that to a central thread, something that's going to guide the paper. 4s typically also just have a lot of wordiness, and as Hamilton College points out, the #1 deadly sin, passive voice. Students who earn 5s are beginning to develop an interpretation, but it's not fully developed, and so that's going to affect criterion A and criterion C. They analyze style and effect, but it may not be tied to that central thread, that meaning. And then there's obviously paragraph structure with some sort of transitions or maybe a claim or two, but the language is not necessarily sophisticated, the structure is not sophisticated. So they're not opening with an assertion, AEC. They're not dealing with transitions. They're not concluding paragraphs. The conclusion itself to the whole paper may be just a repetition of what the student wrote. Try to tackle and grapple with ideas that are confusing to you. That idea that you can think about a claim and a counterclaim is really important for stronger writing. What are the alternate concepts that you may think about in a paper? Students who are earning 6s are writing good papers. They're papers that are probably going to earn A's in colleges as well. There's a clear significance about the meaning behind the passage, the interpretation of what's going on. The idea of meaning is then further developed through style and effect. And then obviously the structure and language are purposeful. There's an architecture to the paper. There's a purpose to each paragraph, and they build on each other, and they're tied together. Students who earn 4s in criterion D, language, typically just don't use the passive voice, and they're not confusing. They're not wordy. So there's some overall ideas about the paper 1. I hope this helps.